It is my pleasure to welcome Henning Wagra, professor of Gettysburg College and Heidelberg University. Now, before coming to Gettysburg, where he's currently a professor for German culture and media studies, Henning worked academically on disinformation through mass media as part of a research network on the history of East Germany television conducted by Humboldt University in Berlin and the universities of Halle and Leipzig. But a topic such as disinformation in media is relevant to him on an even deeper level, biographic level, since he grew up in East Germany and as part of the audience became part of the media dispositive where East and West German media duke it out about facts, about news, about truth, about propaganda. Henning is accompanied today by a wonderful panel of experts, leaders, practitioners, as well as two students who recently attended his Eisenhower Institute workshop on elections and media. Henning, thank you for guiding today's conversation.
Well, thank you, Ben, and good morning and good afternoon, everyone, if you're in Europe. And thanks, Ben, for mentioning the personal relevance this topic has to me. So as he said, I grew up in very late East Germany and very close to the West German border. So I was constantly exposed to two simultaneous and often contradictory channels of communication, the West German Tagesschau, until today, one of the staples of news in West Germany, and the East German Aktuelle Kamera. And fact-checking was a constant and never-ending and never reliable process, right? A schizophrenic situation, if you will, that I thought I had left behind when the wall came down. But if we look at today's polls, we seem to almost near a similar situation. There's only one news outlet the people of the United States trust, no matter where they stand politically. A 2024 YouGov poll found that Americans are 43% more likely to call the Weather Channel, of all places, trustworthy than not. It is a rather sad statement about the state of the fourth estate when out of 50 analyzed US news media, only the single apolitical outlet is perceived as trustworthy. By the way, the second most trusted American news channel is the British BBC. So there's even more a problem when we consider that political information is for most the reason to actually tune into the news. So I think it's fair to say that we are in the middle of a crisis. We have lost the common sense that our traditional news outlets, at least by and large, are trustworthy sources of political information, of knowledge about our world. So where is the shared reality that we used to have? So the problem for this, is not at least active disinformation. So Thomas and Bridget, would you like to take over for a moment?
Yes, Professor. In fact, in today's social climate, references to the mainstream media often evoke distrust and disdain. Gallup reports that only 31% of Americans say they trust mass media to report news fully and fairly, while 36% express no trust at all, the highest level of distrust ever recorded. It is a dramatic decline from the 72% trust levels of the 1970s and even the 45% recorded as recently as 2018. Partisan divides exacerbate the problem. 81% of Democrats express trust in national news outlets compared to just 53% of Republicans. And the younger generations are turning to influencers and podcasts rather than traditional journalism. This erosion of trust has coincided with the mainstreaming of conspiracy theories, anti-vaccine sentiment, and rejection of academic expertise. Democracy requires a shared reality to function, but as confidence in news media fractures, so too does the foundation for informed political discourse.
The evolution of media technology, from mass-produced pamphlets to personalized social media feeds, has fundamentally transformed how political information spreads and shapes society. Where families once gathered around radios, today's media landscape has fragmented what was once shared reality. Political information today is personal. To a degree, traditional mass media has been replaced by echo chambers that pre-select information according to the preference of the recipient. Technology has democratized media production, but it comes at the cost of flooding society with unprecedented volumes of information, while making it increasingly difficult to assess source credibility and bias. Political polarization within media has shifted focus from information to persuasion, eroding common ground. Western democracies face systemic attacks on media trust reminiscent of Lügenpresse or lying press campaigns in the late Weimar Republic.
So overall, as Ben has already mentioned, there are two threats, right? An external threat that we are kind of sort of familiar with. Russian and Chinese disinformation campaigns designed to sow discord and support anti-democratic movements, but also, and maybe even more concerning, internal challenges from domestic actors who deliberately spread false information and undermine democratic institutions. As a result, we have a media landscape where anti-democratic movements exploit a shift in media culture, new technological capabilities to manufacture confusion, division, and distrust. It's a complex topic, but it is one that the well-being of democracies all over the world depends on. Today, we have a fantastic opportunity to discuss this with several high-caliber international experts. So please welcome Kiteri Yocum, Peter Kreko, Martina Guzman, and Maria Skora. I will briefly introduce them and then start with specific questions. So Kiteri Yocum was a former journalist at the German Deutsche Welle, the German equivalent to Voice of America. She worked at ABC, The Wall Street Journal, and Vox Media. She's a leading specialist on media and communications, and she has actively worked on the topic of responsible journalism. Kiteri is currently the supervising producer of On with Kara Swisher. Peter Kreko is the executive director of the Political Capital Institute and a research associate at Central European University in Budapest in Hungary. Budapest, I should say, I'm sorry. He's a behavioral scientist and disinformation expert on the psychological drivers of belief in disinformation, its political institutional impact, state-sponsored disinformation, and, maybe most importantly, effective counter strategies. Martina Guzman is a Detroit-based journalist and media innovator. Martina is the founder of Verdad, a tool that monitors ethnic media for disinformation, created to fill a critical gap in how misinformation spreads through ethnic media. Verdad, if I understand this correctly, finds disinformation and translates it into English to arm researchers and journalists with the tools to track and challenge it. Maria Skora is a political consultant and a policy fellow at Das Progressive Zentrum, a think tank based in Berlin. Maria has been researching the rise of authoritarian nationalist anti-democratic movements in Poland, in Germany, and in other European countries. So, as mentioned, I want to begin with a specific set of questions to our experts, but at the end, they all go back to two fundamental issues, and I hope we'll have enough time to return to them. So given that there is the First Amendment, right? First Amendment protections in place, what concrete steps can democratic nations take to address disinformation without crossing free speech lines? Second, is there a way to rebuild trust in the media, or are we beyond that point in the evolution of modern media? And last not least, beyond discussion events like ours today, what international cooperation can we envision for democracies to battle disinformation? So, Kiteri, I would like to start with you, since you have worked both in Germany and in the United States in public media environments, but also in private ones, in very traditional fact-oriented media, as well as in formats that, shall we say, don't shy away from polemics. So could you maybe say a word in comparison about the situation in Germany and in the United States? What structural differences do you see that seem to make the German system more resilient, at least to a degree, to disinformation than the American one?
Well, I mean, I think it starts off with the legal basis for journalism. The legal basis for journalism in the United States is obviously the First Amendment, which just says that there is a freedom of the press. And what that freedom of the press means and what freedom of speech means has had to be negotiated over time and is very dependent on the political will of the time. So that continues to go through courts again and again, and that's how we kind of have built out a system of protection of the press. But that protection of the press doesn't necessarily go along with a responsibility of the press. And so I would say the fundamental difference between the United States and Germany is that in the US, there's a protection of the press that is attacked and has to be renegotiated. Whereas in Germany, there's an actual Presserecht, Pressekodex. These are laws and rules and regulations that not only protect the press, but also ensure that the press follows and has its own responsibilities, right? And so one of the main responsibilities of the press in Germany is to tell the truth. You cannot call yourself press, you cannot call yourself the news if you do not respect what is a fundamentally provable veracity of some sort of basis of truth. And so I think, and that, you know, it goes into much more complexity than that. It's a German law, so obviously it is very bureaucratic. But there's both a German law and there are organizations that, again, have not just said, we have sort of certain ideas that we follow in terms of truth and veracity, but they've put together a codex and they've said, these are the rules that we follow as journalists. And I think that differentiation does create a better protection and a societal expectation for what is considered to be news, what is considered to be opinion, what is considered and what the public expects from things under those titles.
Can you also say a word about, public media, right? So Germany invests significant money in a public media system that is akin to the British BBC. And I wonder if that infrastructural fact has not an impact on media and information and disinformation as well.
Yeah, I mean, probably a lot of people on this call have heard a lot of the current conversation about the funding of the Center for Public Broadcasting, the funding of NPR. The reality is that the government funding of NPR in the United States is a very small portion of the entire budget for NPR, whereas in Germany, it has a federal media system, right? So that means that there is a national ARD centralized media that is both television and radio. It's broadcast media. We're talking only about broadcast media in this sense. Obviously, the printed press has a different set of rules, but the broadcast media is a federal system. So there's a centralized organization, and then each state, each region has its own regional heads, and they collaborate, they share information. I mean, and Maria would be able to talk about this obviously more as well. And so I think the difference there is whereas NPR has member stations that are regional, they are mostly responsible for getting their funding from their listeners. And PBS works in a very similar way, and therefore they are very reliant in a similar way to private media, both in Germany and the United States. They are reliant on ads or sponsors. They are reliant on individuals to give them money, and they are reliant on the government, but the government can take that away. So it is not considered a right of, it is not part of the right of the public to have a public accessible media. And we're seeing that in the United States all over the place, where both right now, I mean, if you can read numerous articles about the death of small regional broadcasters and NPR broadcasters, because they don't have, if they're not getting any money from the state, they really don't have enough money to survive. And that would not happen in Germany. So the right to having public free media is also something that is guaranteed. Again, freedom of the press does not encapsulate that at all.
Okay. Well, Katerina, you've already kind of sort of passed the torch to Maria. So, Maria, you have been active researching the rise of authoritarian and nationalist anti-democratic movements all over Europe. So maybe you can expand the comparison that we started with Katerina and tell us a little more about what you are seeing in these countries. So what issues do you see when it comes to media, to information, and to active acts of disinformation? And what would you say, what tools does democracy have to defend this and to combat disinformation?
Thank you so much for having me and for giving me this opportunity to share some reflections with you. I'm not an expert on the media, however, I think we can expand this conversation to the public sphere and the public discourse. And I'm most familiar with the German and Polish context, also the American to some extent. So I'll, to be honest and true with the audiences, I will focus a little bit on the two countries. Obviously, the comparative perspective is a great one because it helps you to get a bigger picture and also draw lines between the dots, connect the dots, and see tendencies and trends that seem to repeat in many places. Well, Germany and Poland are very different in a way. Also today, like, the big topic in Germany is the economy. It's stagnating. A big topic is migration, but the integration and the migration pressure. And Germany is still relatively far away from the war that is going on the European continent, from the war in Ukraine. This is the opposite to Poland, where the war is on the doorstep, literally, and that, of course, has an impact on people, on also what the media are talking about. The economy is still booming, and the country is experiencing for the first time in its history rather immigration than emigration. So it's the opposite of Germany, when migration and the diversity in a society is a lived everyday situation. Poland is only in early days, and that brings the tensions that perhaps were visible in Germany 50 years ago. But at the same time, these two countries undergo similar processes, facing globalization and digitization and robotization. The pandemic impacted us heavily. The trembling transatlantic alliance is very heartfelt in Germany, but also in Poland, not only because of the security architecture, but also economic relations. And I'm talking about it because all those phenomena, also the migration pressures, they affect living conditions, they affect perceptions of the living conditions. And here we come to, I think, what Germany and Poland have had in common recently, which is the rise of the new right and the rise of those sentiments, of those narratives, which I see repeating in between two countries. It's not social agenda; it's the individualistic economic agenda. Low taxes, no welfare, warfare. It's distrust in institutions, including the media, the mainstream media. Back to market forces and sort of like organic communities like family or communities around alternative media. It's a backlash towards conservative values and chauvinism and a certain ethnonationalism that these new right parties promote, focus on safety and security also in that context. And interestingly, isolationism, not engaging in armed conflicts like the one in Ukraine. And you probably think, oh, wow, that sounds pretty much like the MAGA wing of the Republican Party. And that, in fact, is something I think becomes a common or very similar phenomenon in the Western countries. And this is also affecting the voter structure or how people vote. It's mostly young men from maybe smaller cities, not big cities, quite well off, but sometimes also experiencing economic difficulties, this relative deprivation, which tend to fall to in the narratives offered by the new right. And that brings me to the conclusion, to connect back to our topic today of how we move around or how we function in the media sphere or a sphere of public debate. I think it's pretty important to remember that facts are not necessarily perceptions, but perceptions are very often the reality. So people, not only the voter profile that I've described, but generally I have a feeling people are more and more susceptible to diverse narratives. You've already mentioned that there's such a variety of alternative narratives. I don't want to say alternative facts, because it's either facts or opinions. But unfortunately, especially also these political actors, the new right, also shape perceptions and shape political reality. And they don't shy away from fake news or conspiracy theories, which in turn shake and influence in a negative way the public debate and distort the image of really serious challenges we're actually all facing. But that would be my reflection on what I see on not only both sides of Oder River in Poland and Germany, but also actually in the United States.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very quick follow-up, Maria. So when you say that, one thing both countries share is the right-wing, the rise of, right-wing populist parties, and it seems to be a standard tool they use to sow distrust in established media, right? So the system media that Thomas has referenced, or the lying press, things that we see also in this country, right? So if we face the problem that people distrust the media, then that is to a degree also an effect of people actively undermining trust in media, right? And if that is something that both Poland and Germany and the US share, is there if we had to develop ways of countering that? Do you see anything that is feasibly doable to actually counter this active process of eroding trust in media?
I think it's a million-dollar question, which I will try to crack very quickly with a few ideas. Well, trust is a key word in our conversation, and from my point of view, if you are eroding trust as a tool of voter mobilization, as a tool of political communication for the benefit of your party, then we have a fundamental problem with eroding political culture. I'm not saying that politics in the past, in the good old days, was all virtuous and fair, but there is a certain new style or a new politics emerging with operating consciously and with disinformation. And the other thing is, of course, the different new technology that affects the ways how we communicate. And of course, I'm talking about the rise of content platforms and social media, the direct connection between the politicians or public opinion leaders with the consumers of those content, the consumers who can also produce content and share it. So the media platforms play a role here too, without regulation, without fact-checking. In Europe and the EU, there is actually an attempt of legislation to curb it, to have it under control, but let's see how it will work out. And the last thing is us as consumers, us as voters, us as citizens, and media literacy and internet literacy. Here, in a way, technology has leaped forward, and perhaps us as societies haven't caught up yet to consume media, consume content consciously and responsibly. That would be my three ideas that I would have in designing perhaps answers to those phenomena.
Yeah, thank you. I think this is really insightful. So, Martina, since we already talk about social media, you have been a social and racial justice journalist for years and recently began to focus on the threats to and dysfunction of democracy. So how did you make that turn, and what have you found about the use of disinformation towards Black, Latino, and often marginalized political audiences? That's maybe my first question. But also tell us about that new tool of yours, Verdad, that is designed to fill a critical gap in how misinformation spreads through ethnic and non-language media. Could you tell us a little bit about how that works, what makes it effective? And I imagine you have faced this question before. How do you counter the argument that even fact-checking, that even tools like yours are considered partisan, not analytical of politics, but political itself?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. And where do I start? So I think how did I make the transition was the first part of the question. So I'm a race and justice journalism who has focused for well over a decade, almost 15 years, on Black, Latino, and immigrant communities. And mostly the Latino community because I'm of Mexican descent. And I've grown up understanding that the news does not reflect us in any way. And so I wanted to counter that as part of my career. So in working in the Latino community and reporting in the Latino community in the United States, which is something that major media outlets completely ignore our community, I found a story that I was tipped off by a very credible source that Russians were buying airtime on Spanish language radio stations in the United States. And I was completely floored because I understood in that moment that so few people covered the Latino community that very few people knew that this was happening. And so I embarked on this huge research project interviewing people across the United States to find out that who actually really knew that this was happening. And there was like a handful of people, very credible people who knew that this was happening. And as I embarked on the study, and it was a big series that I was going to produce, I began to ask people, how are you monitoring radio? Because this was Spanish language radio specifically. And they would all tell me the same thing, that they were monitoring it by listening to it. And they were doing it like I was doing, spending hours and hours listening to the radio, trying to find this mis and disinformation. And so I began to look for the tool that would help me, only to realize that a tool didn't exist. So what I did was leave the research project. I handed it over to someone else, and I set out to develop a tool. Now, I'm not anyone who works in the AI space. I'm a race and justice reporter, but I understood how critical it was. I understood that disinformation in separating ethnic communities, we had just come out of this election. And I knew that people who had for decades not voted for a candidate like Donald Trump were now voting for a candidate like Donald Trump. And I wanted to understand the reasons why. And the tool really allowed for us to see into a world that was a complete blind spot for a very, very long time, and to listen to ethnic radio and to listen to commercials that were disinformation, to listen to hosts, who were parroting word for word what was happening on Radio Sputnik, and having these call-in shows where then people would call in and repeat the same things over and over again. So not only did you have the host repeating disinformation and spreading disinformation, but the people who were calling in were doing the same thing. So we spread out across the battleground states around the time of the presidential election to see, because we felt that the election would be won or lost in those states, and began to see and get insight into this world of ethnic radio stations, and realize that like ethnic radio stations, and I believe this is the same in Europe, they are a cultural lifeline to these communities. They are a cultural lifeline to ethnic communities. They identify with the hosts, they identify with the music, they identify with the topics of conversation. And in the United States, Latinos, we are all things. We are doctors, we are lawyers, we are politicians, but we are also in the service industry. And it is in the service industry, when you're on construction sites, when you are in kitchens, when you are in hotels. I mean, the entire Las Vegas industry would collapse, as would the construction industry without Latino labor. And so you go, and recently I was at a hotel and the chambermaid was pushing her cart and she had a little radio in it, listening to the Latino radio as she cleaned rooms, right? And so they're getting this information without anyone monitoring it. The FCC in the United States doesn't have the capacity to monitor ethnic radio stations. And so what Verdad did was monitor 24 hours a day radio stations in battleground states. So the link between reporting in the Latino community and creating this tool was, very simple, very easy. It was not like a world that I didn't know. I think the difficult part was the technology. And I think, did I answer the second part of your question, which was?
Well, the last question is that I have that fact-checking mechanisms now, they have also become part of the polemics, right? So
that's right, yes. So what we did was, when we invented Verdad, and I encourage you to go to verdad.app and register if you want to use this. This is a free tool, mostly designed for journalists and academics and investigative reporters. So what we did was what we found after the 2024 election, right? And coming up to it, we were able to launch the tool a few weeks before, was that we saw all of this disinformation that we had mostly seen on the far right now happening on the far left. So we added a tool, a button, where you can get disinformation on the far left and on the far right and in the center. So we were able to address that issue to see where people were landing and what people were looking for when it came to disinformation. And this was like disinformation on the left, that Kamala Harris had won the election, and that this was all, similar to what you saw on the right during January 6th, right? In the last in Trump's former presidential election. And so that tool allowed us to see what was happening in the left, right, and center.
Yeah, well, this is super interesting, and we have to come back to this. But Peter, I really want to ask you also, because Hungary has been often seen as a case study, and the influence of media in somewhat eroding democracy to a degree. So maybe you can tell us a little bit how the last 15 years went as a progression from a more democratic traditional media landscape to something that is more a state-controlled narrative today. And crucially, where do you see counter trends, right? What has been done on the other side? So are there effective interventions that defenders of democracy can use?
Yes, thanks a lot, Henning, and thank you for having me in this brilliant discussion. Yeah, your questions will be a bit difficult to respond in a few minutes and to give a total overview of 15 years plus all the solutions. But in a very telegraphic note, I would say, first of all, that and this is not unique to Hungary. So Viktor Orbán returned to power in 2010. So he was the prime minister of Hungary before that as well, between 1998 and 2002. So he returned to power in 2010 with the experience that if you don't have the media, then you can lose the election even if you have pretty good economic results and policy deliverables as they had in their first term. So as one person close to the prime minister back then told, it's like they wanted a wall-to-wall media system. So it sounds a bit of totalitarian in its approach, but we have to have it all. That was the idea. I would not say that the Hungarian regime is totalitarian, but I think their approach to the media system is definitely something that has its monolithic elements and principles. So after winning a two-thirds election, an election with a two-thirds majority in 2010, Fidesz had the ability to change all the laws and regulation and the legal framework in Hungary. It's a constitutional majority, so they have changed all the institutions that are relevant, from the Constitutional Court until the Media Authority Council and supervisory bodies, and also the competition supervisory body, and the list goes on. And the principle behind the takeover of the media, Hungary had a pretty diverse, and I would say not fragmented, but colorful media landscape before 2010. But the idea was something similar that Vladimir Putin had after he experienced after the Kursk submarine catastrophe. So at the very early days, practically, of his presidency, that a free and independent media can hurt your popularity and make you look incompetent. So to avoid that, as in Russia, in Hungary as well, government close, businessmen, both media, private media, some of them from Western companies as well, who were ready to solve it, and then turn them into different pro-governmental, different voices of pro-governmental media. So, but it was seemingly private until about 2018. In 2018, the state had a great leap and practically took many of the outlets, and in Hungary, as a result of this process, we have a huge conglomerate, a foundation, a giga foundation consisting more than 500 media outlets in a country of 10 million people, 8 million voters. So that, and these media outlets receive everyday direct orders from the Prime Minister's office. We know it from whistleblowers, we know it from people who work there. So it's directly politically controlled. And let's imagine that Rupert Murdoch wakes up in a day and just decide to give Fox News to the states, to the American states. It's hard to imagine, right? So it was also a revelation that it was never really private media, but it was in the states' hand from the very beginning. Right now, we have the most centralized media system in Hungary within the whole European Union. And there are some attempts right now, the European Media Freedom Act, for example, to counter that. But as Maria said, with the Digital Services Act, let's see where it goes. And connecting a bit to Martina's point, to talk a bit about the content as well. So these are the institutional aspects, but what Hungary had practically become a very successful laboratory of post-truth. And of course, it's easy to, shape the public opinion if you have, let's say, 80% of the media outlets. But still, the narratives were important. So it's not only about the institution, it's also about the content. And some of the content is, viral everywhere, anti-immigration rhetoric, even if in a country where we have one of the most, homogeneous population within the whole European Union, unlike in many countries in Western Europe, but also COVID-related disinformation, pro-Russian and anti-Ukrainian disinformation. And at the heart of all that, I think there is a kind of victim mentality that you have in minority communities as well. So we are the second-hand citizens of the European Union. We are sidelined within the Western institutional systems. Therefore, we have to fight for our rights. And if you have this victim identity, and it's a political product as well, of course, then all conspiracy theories and disinformation is just much easier to sell. So this is about the narrative part, and very briefly about what can be done. So unfortunately, what I see in Hungary at the moment, Orbán has a serious challenger at the moment. Right now, he's not leading the polls. His ability to shape the public opinion is not as successful as it was before. But what we experience, and of course, it's a result of Orbán is in power for 15 years. So there is a tribal politics in Hungary. The challenger of Viktor Orbán, Péter Magyar, is a soft but right-wing populist politician as well, who is not shy to distort the truth when he thinks it brings an advantage to him. And I would not say that it's totally the same, especially not in institutional background, not even in content. But I think the big danger is that if disinformation and this tribal politics start to emerge on one side, it is becoming more symmetric after a while. So there are some good anti-disinformation projects. I will advertise a bit our own, called Hungarian Digital Media Observatory, that combines research, fact-checking, and media literacy. I'm happy to talk a bit about the content a bit later as well. So I think, and honestly, generally, I think we have some good methods on how to counter disinformation. The big question is that, if the education system and if all the politicians are against this trend and just working on spreading disinformation, then if you want to counter disinformation, it's a bit like putting off forest fire with a water pistol.
Yeah, well, thank you. So you already made reference to the United States. So Maria, maybe I can come back to you. You and John Austin, who is the senior fellow of the Eisenhower Institute here at Gettysburg College, recently published an article in the Washington Monthly where you talked not just about external threats, where we talked about disinformation campaigns from Russia, from China, from Iran, all these things, but from our own political leaders, right? So we all of a sudden have a White House press office where the truth doesn't seem to be, as valid as it used to be, right? So what has happened there, right? How do we face these internal threats? We might not be in danger of, nationalizing the media quite yet, but what threats do we face internally, and what can be done about them?
Yes, indeed, we were writing about the external malign influence, but it's very often interwoven or intertwined. I mean, Germany has been a main target of Russian disinformation since the pandemic, and mostly on economic decline. inflation, migration, but also reinforcing pro-Russian sentiments, which are pretty strong in certain sections of the society. Poland has become a target of external malign influence, especially after the war in Ukraine started, after the Russian attack on Ukraine, but for a different from a different angle. Actually, anti-Ukrainian sentiments are very much pronounced through disinformation from the outside in Poland to weaken the support for the neighboring country. But why I'm mentioning it, because it's often intertwined, this external influence, because sometimes it supports or tries to attack domestic actors. And we see it both in Poland, but especially in Germany, where the Greens are much attacked by accounts, bots, propaganda and disinformation coming most probably from the Kremlin. So the problem is more complex and affecting also the domestic actors perpetuating the disinformation. Well, I would like to go back to the original sin that I've mentioned. Unfortunately, existing social divisions or conflicts, as well as crises, are weaponized for political gains. Radicalizing the debate is mobilizing voters. Some of the party leaders, like the Polish Konfederacja, don't even shy away to say it in public. Yes, we use it because it works for us. About you mentioned nationalizing the media, and I like to connect to what Peter was talking about. Of course, Hungary is a very extreme case, but the Polish public media not that long ago were also completely under the control of the government, and different diverse content was projected and served to the general population audience. It's again the question of resilience, how resilient citizens are to biased or politically politicized content coming from not only the public media, but also private media, which is also very polarized. So I would say, the trust that we were talking about, media literacy, and again, political accountability seem to me the triangle of, well, yeah, triangle of what? the solution to that very difficult problem, not only how to counter the external malign influence, but also the danger coming from within.
Martina? You're muted, Martina. You need to unmute.
Sorry, I thought I unmuted. I have a point to what Maria was saying and to what Peter was saying earlier. When we talk about sort of distrust, right? There's a couple reasons why this is happening. Like it's not a vacuum. And for a long time, ethnic communities in the United States, and I can say that also I've seen this in Europe, right? That there is a huge distrust long before all of this conversation about disinformation of ethnic communities and the media because of how they're portrayed, right? So long before we're having these conversations about like how white Americans don't distrust the media, Black people and Latino people for decades have already stopped and had left reading and listening and buying traditional news. So they were already getting their news from someone else because of this distrust, right? Then you have the distrust of like white Americans, right? Which was easy to happen because there was this moment, and I think Maria was talking to it, when you have like this element of despair of like factories closing, right? And I come from the industrial Midwest where we have seen factories close from one day to the next. And I was surprised in a recent trip to Germany, there was a factory that's going to close like in 2, 3, 4 years from now, and they are already preparing the workers for how to do that, which I thought was brilliant because that doesn't happen in the United States. And so from one day to the next, like you're getting a paycheck, you're paying for your family, right? And everything is going well for you. And then they close a factory and you've been left with nothing. That despair is like an open door like into the world of disinformation and getting alternative news to sort of satisfy that feeling of like what's going to happen next and where am I, and like the anger that comes with despair, right? So when you talk about building trust, especially in the world that I work in ethnic communities. Recently, what we did, because you can rebuild trust, right? We stopped reporting comprehensively on ethnic communities. So what we have to do is cover ethnic communities comprehensively, to tell the truth about them, to report on all of their issues, not just on immigration, not just around violence. And so I'm a community news reporter at an outlet called Planet Detroit. And what we're doing in order to build trust is we're having the very first time a conference where we invited a room full of journalists and a room full of environmental justice advocates who have long been the recipients of the worst environmental disasters, like poisoning of waters, dirty soil so they can't grow gardens. And we're bringing them together. And the conference is literally called Building Trust. So putting these people into a room together where journalists can sit with environmental justice advocates and to like talk about who they are just as people first, right? And to begin the conversation of how do you build trust again? You absolutely can rebuild it. So this idea that we can't is that we must start with, in my work, ethnic communities and begin to report on them and bring them into the conversation. So I'm super proud of like this conference that we're having, because I think it's going to be this sort of paradigm shifting moment.
Mhm. Yeah, I think this speaks to one opportunity we might have, right? That at the moment when we lose a mass trust in audiences, maybe one strategy is community verification, right? That trust is rebuilt within smaller communities. And that applies also to social media and fact checking within there. I just see that in the question and answers there are two questions by Arnold Weinfeld. I hope I pronounced this correctly. And maybe we can just tackle those quickly. So the first one is, how do you establish trust given so many receive information and news these days via social media platforms, right? Is that only a crisis or is that a chance? And what are best practices or strategies?
Yeah.
Kitai, do you want to take
Yeah,
that?
I would love to jump in and also to speak to what Martina was just saying. In fact, I had written on my page what Martina is doing with Verdad is going where the audience is. So that's exactly, I think, the strategy that media needs to have, and I think we are seeing this right now, and also understanding what they want and trust. Exactly, I absolutely would underscore everything that Martina just said. Trust in institutions may be failing, but trust in people is not, right? That is what people are looking for, is trust in people. And I think that's what you're seeing right now in the United States in a fragmentation of media, is that a lot of journalists who are considered to be trusted sources for audiences are breaking off from big name institutions that have lost the trust and are starting, as Martina mentioned, a lot of their own products, right? So there is a proliferation of new media outlets that have been started by big name and trusted journalists. There are people are starting their own newsletters and their own podcasts. We're seeing, and it's not just, and this is something that gives me a lot of hope in our audiences, because if you look at the best, one of the top newsletters on Substack, it's a historian, right? Heather Cox Richardson, who writes historical political analysis, is one of the top people on Substack. And she has international audiences. That is absolutely gives me so much hope in audiences, that they are looking to people who they trust because they have a academic background and they have political analysis and they show their sources, right? All of the things, the transparency that we would otherwise want to support. And I think when we're talking about how do we regain trust, I think it is taking that step back. I think it is providing more transparency. It is having events like Martina is talking about, where there is an actual one-on-one engagement with audiences. But this is also something that can be done much more effectively on social media than it could ever be done when you have huge broadcast institutions or huge news institutions, where the distance between the audience and the institutions is so great. And I think we're seeing institutions right now, and when I speak about institutions, I'm talking about media institutions. We see them having community outreach. We see them trying to bridge that gap. We also see them trying to engage with people on social media in a way that is honest and reciprocal, and of course that can go both ways, and it also can be used negatively, right? I'm not going to say this is a proliferation platform for misinformation, absolutely, right? But I think one of the failings of mass media was for a long time to gatekeep their journalists, gatekeep the people who actually had the trust of the audiences from participating on those platforms. And I think we're seeing them shift their perspective. We're seeing them invest in their journalists, give their journalists more freedom, give their journalists more direct access to audiences. We're seeing journalists break away, create their own audiences, create their own ability to converse. And I think those are the positives that I can see in what we're seeing in terms of an attention-based economy, or in terms of a splitting of a bigger media.
Well, I will say, Kateri, and that goes to a point that Wolfgang Mössinger makes in the question and answer. Group loyalty can be a productive tool, but it's a double-edged sword, isn't it? So this, could equally lead to just more effective disinformation as well. So just to quickly read what the question from Wolfgang was, Martina was speaking about rebuilding trust, but what to do when journalists are not interested in rebuilding trust, but only propagating whatever their masters, private or state, want them to propagate. But I want to give Peter a chance to add. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Just very briefly connecting on Martinez and Kateri's point on counter strategies, and so we with a bit of evidence from our experimental research. So what we have found in our experiment as possible interventions that can reduce the receptivity to disinformation and also increase the ability of the participants to recognize fake news and differentiate between real and fake. So our interventions had three main pillars. One was that so we tried to stay out of the expert role, in the sense that I think if the audience feels that you want to establish a high asymmetry, that you are the authority and you want to tell the others what to think, then it's just not going to work. So we are living in a populist era where you have to find to bridge these gaps of authority somehow. So first element was that try to, so we asked practically the participants we gave them a list on how to spot fake news, but then we asked them to write their own recommendations based on what we have written, and to put their own as well, so they have become teachers themselves. Second element was that it was pro-social. So we asked them to explain it to your friend or to your grandma. I know it sounds ageist, but it's like for youngsters, it's something that worked rather well, to explain to your loved one how to spot fake news and how to react. And yeah, the third element was that this way they could also persuade themselves. So we have built on the persuasion, and then they had to be actively involved. So I think we are over the era where anyone can just preach others what they should read and how they should consume information. So if you don't bridge this gap, and also if you don't involve them and involve them also in some kind of pro-social activities, then I think it's becoming rather difficult. And what does it mean? I think it also means that online interventions definitely has their boundaries and limits in terms of producing long-lasting results.
Yeah, I think all this points us to maybe a paradigm shift that we see, right? Where we say, the age of mass media might be over, and the mechanisms that we develop to trust in them. But maybe we are, as Bridget said at the beginning, we are in a more personalized era of information, and the strategies that we just discussed, right? So community journalism, fact checking within groups, these things might be first strategies that might lead us much further. We are almost at the end. So I think we have at most 1 minute. So if anyone would like to say a final word before we return it back to Ben, Martina?
To anyone who's listening, this is like a strategy I've recently taken on. It's going to take all of us, not just the people on this panel, everyone, everywhere I go, if I'm speaking in front of people or if I'm on a panel, I'm like, you have to help stop disinformation too. Oftentimes I've told people, you know, that's fake. That's not real. You know that. Why did you share that? Not in like a combative way, but getting everyone to really understand that the responsibility for combating disinformation is on all of us, not just like academics, not just journalists. People look to us like, what are you going to do about it? No, what are we going to do about it? Because it's flooding every part of every radio, news, television, politicians. So we all must combat it together.
I mean, to a degree, that we should also say disinformation is not just something, it's not something that we experience passively, right? It's also a test of loyalty to a degree, right? So often people might know that what they hear are blatant lies, but you still have to subscribe to them to show your loyalty to your tribe, to your in-group. And I think that is another very difficult question that we face. So Ben, I will give it back to you. Thank you very much.
And I would just start with, I could listen to you, Henning, the panelists, the students for hours and hours, but Martina, what a great note to end on. It takes all of us. That there is no silver bullet solution. It's not only a small group of people fixing this, but all of us. And I think conversations like today's with idea sharing, being able to talk about your experiences, what you're seeing from your corners of the globe, also very, very important. So thank you, panelists, students, Henning, for sharing your experience, knowledge, and expertise for this engaging and informative conversation. Not the end, but certainly a continuation of a critical issue that we are facing. Of course, thank you all to you who have joined via Zoom or tuning in during Facebook or listening to or watching a later broadcast of this, being a part of this conversation, being a part of the solution to a critical issue. And of course, thanks to all of our Heartlands Transformation Network partners, led by Eisenhower Institute Senior Fellow John Austin, for leading the charge, bringing together these voices and exploring critical, pressing issues together in a transatlantic way to really broaden the conversation while also deepening it and informing it. As a reminder, for more information about the Heartlands Transformation Network and upcoming JES programs, publications, more engagements, head over to our website, jeserie.org. For the Jefferson Educational Society, a proud partner in the Heartlands Transformation Network, I'm Ben Spegan. Thanks for listening and learning with us.